Now.
Okay.
Now.
Okay, well, thanks to everybody for dropping in. And as always, thanks to my executive producer, Dara, and our Patreon subscribers, Yippee, and also Chris Lee and Karen Lee Duffel. So subscribe on Patreon to get exclusive, exciting stuff. They send you stuff, not pictures of my feet.
Yeah, I think you're really stirring people off from joining Patreon by keep talking about pictures of your feet. That does not happen.
It's light humor. It's light humor. I wouldn't have given Chris pictures of my feet.
No, probably would have killed you.
Yeah. So as always, thanks to people on Patreon. And when you hop on to the show, please comment and let us know that you're there. So a bunch of people suggested last week Native American history. I'm looking at, I think, Kira, Lynn, and also Brittany Wimmer. And like, the first thing about Native American history is it's like saying like France. It's like, well, like what part of it, right? I mean, like that's a pretty big topic. And so the other problem with Native American history is it's also one of the parts of history I don't know a huge amount about. So I feel like maybe we'll revisit that topic over the winter break when I to have more time to like come up with what to talk about and like do some thinking about it. Probably would be something like the Iroquois League, which I think would be interesting to talk about. And there's also a lot of documentation you can look at there. But people did mention that, so we will try to get around to it. And then for longtime fan of the show, Chris Miller has mentioned a bunch of times, and also so did Cindy last week, about they wanted to hear about various historical movies that I think are good or bad. So I figured we would do that. That's a good topic. I got a whole list I gave Dara to give me, so we'll go through and talk about why they're good, why they're bad, and what's good or bad about them. And so also, if there's a historical movie I haven't talked about yet, put it in the comments, because if I've seen it, or if I know anything about it, I'll tell you about it. And if it's on my list, we'll do it, right? So, but I know Chris has been asking about that one again, and so rest assured, Chris, we're going to talk about some Mel Gibson movies. Give me the piece of paper. I gotta add one because there was another one I forgot.
Hawk obviously wants you to talk about the Patriot.
We're not coming today.
Okay. Yeah, we're not only going to crap on Mel Gibson today, although we will a little bit. All right. So is that Hawk? Did Hawk mention the Patriot?
Mm-hmm.
We do that one. Okay, so we'll do that one first. Okay, so the Patriot came out. I want to say it's like in the late '90s, early 2000s, something like that. And it was Mel Gibson's sort of big historical epic where he plays a guy like loosely adapted from Sir Francis Marion, and of course features extensive scenes set during the American Revolutionary War. The Patriot's a garbage movie. It's absolutely garbage. So there's a few things about it you can mention. I actually had a student in my class who was a stuntman who was hired to serve as a soldier, an extra, and they hired a bunch of stuntmen because they expected him to like get blown up and stuff. And he said in some scenes I was an American, and in some scenes I was a redcoat. And he's like, they just issued us, uniforms that we would change into. But he had a bunch of pictures of himself with Heath Ledger, and he said he knew Heath Ledger really well, and Heath Ledger was like a really cool guy, and he became very close with him, and of course was deeply saddened by his passing. And so he was a sort of one of the minor characters in the movie. And so what you see about the Patriot first is it's a very odd movie, because if you watch Mel Gibson's character throughout the movie, it seems like the only thing he cares about is his family. Like, he spends the entire first act of the movie resolutely refusing to go fight the British, and he only comes out and actually fights them because they attack his family and like kill and injure members of his family. And so it's like, how is he a patriot? It should not be called the Patriot. Roger Ebert, I think, said it should be called the Family Man. It shouldn't be called the Patriot, it should be called the Family Man, because it's the only thing he cares about, right? And so it's a very sort of quixotic movie. And so a few things you can mention that have attracted a certain degree of historical opprobrium. The first thing is that it plays fast and loose with the racial politics of the Revolutionary War. There's a famous scene where there's an African-American guy in Mel Gibson's like band of merry men who is a slave, and the implication that he gets is that if he fights for the revolution, he'll be free. Well, no. Some states offered people the chance to free their slaves in return for their enlistment, but there was no blanket policy of any state to do that. In fact, the southern states were quite clear upon their conditionality of joining the revolution was continued support for slavery. In the Declaration, there was anti-slave language that was taken out in order to get the delegates from South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina to support the revolution at all, which they might not have done. And so even Jefferson's somewhat, elliptical language attacking slavery in the Declaration was taken out. And in fact, when Admiral Dunmore, the British admiral who attacked Charleston, South Carolina, when he issued a proclamation offering to free slaves during the war in return for the slaves joining the British cause, that was what galvanized most Southerners, like Mel Gibson's character, off of the bench, so to speak, off of the fence, to actually support the revolution. So the movie gets that totally wrong. In addition, it's Jason Isaacs, I think, plays the malevolent British general. And there's an infamous scene where he goes to a small town that is sheltering some members of Mel Gibson's family. I think it's Heath Ledger's character. And he goes into this town and he gets them all in church on Sunday, and he demands that they turn over the revolutionary guys, and they refuse to do it. And so he orders the windows of the church boarded up. He shuts the door, and he makes one of the guys who is a British supporter, an American British supporter, a Tory, or a loyalist, as the British call it. He makes the loyalists set the church on fire. And it's a pretty gruesome scene, not least of which because this is shockingly reminiscent of things that the Nazis did on the Eastern Front. Right? It's almost, the Nazis routinely did that. They walled people up in barns, and they shot them as they climbed out and set the barns on fire and stuff. And so it's not to say that the American Revolution wasn't violent. It was, in many respects, an actual civil war that split American communities in half over their support for or opposition to the revolution. But that level of violence was pretty shocking. And at the same time, they hang a lampshade on it by having other British commanders complain about Jason Isaacs' character, being like, you're going to alienate all those Americans, right? You're going to make them all hate us. But instead of a higher-ranking British general just telling him, don't do that, the implication is somehow that he's like totally autonomous. He's like, I can do what I want. And everybody's just like, oh, well, whatever. As opposed to some general sitting down saying, stop killing American civilians. It's counterproductive, which is a discussion the British have. And so that the movie presents this sort of very, very strange take on the American Revolution that plays fast and loose with a number of themes. Right? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Mostly it seems it's like a lot of Tom Cruise movies where the point of the movie is basically to make Tom Cruise kick ass. And it's not really, there's no point in the plot or anything. It's just, here's a bunch of stunts Tom Cruise is going to do to make himself feel good. And basically Mel Gibson wanted to kill a bunch of British dudes. And they set it to the, to Fife music or whatever. And so The Patriot is not my favorite Revolutionary War movie. It's arguably one of my least favorite movies overall, all things considered. I think it's a terrible movie. Two thumbs down, 2 thumbs way down.
Hawk also asks that you talk about Glory, because I guess
Glory
his uncle was an extra in.
Who was that?
Hawk.
Who was an extra in what?
His uncle was an extra.
Glory is actually a fairly accurate movie that depicts the 54th Massachusetts, which was a regiment of African American soldiers raised during the Civil War in 1862 or 3. They were referred to as U.S. colored troops, and at first they were paid significantly less than white soldiers, but over the course of the war, that pay gap was eradicated at the order of the president, and over the course of 1864, they contributed significantly to the campaigns that Grant fought against Lee in Virginia after Gettysburg. And the 54th Massachusetts was the first major regiment of U.S. colored troops, came out of Boston. Later, they would include, among other things, escaped and runaway slaves in their ranks in the colored troops regiments. And they the 54th went down, I want to say, to North Carolina, and they basically got their ass kicked attacking a Confederate fort. But on the other hand, it was sort of seen as dispelling the myth that like black people can't fight, like black men are cowards. Because this regiment of black soldiers attacked this heavily defended fort, suffered terrible casualties, but like fought as hard as they could. And it was sort of seen as a vindication of the idea that African American men could contribute to the war effort. And for many African American men, it was unfair that they had to fight for their freedom in a sense. But they viewed it as a way to unimpeachably stake a claim on citizenship, right? The idea is that at the end of the war, if you're a veteran in a uniform and you fought, like nobody can say that you don't deserve the same treatment as everyone else, right? No one can gainsay your claim on American citizenship. Fun story: Matthew Broderick's character in Glory is a Robert Gould Shaw. Shaw was appointed the colonel of the regiment, and he dies in the end of the movie. And apparently, his family wanted to have his body dug up from the mass grave it was on at the fort and taken back to Beacon Hill in Boston, where he'd be buried with the rest of the family. And they wrote a letter to the Confederate commander asking for permission to send a boat down to, pay some people to dig him up. And the Confederate commander refused and said, "No, I buried him with his N-word soldiers." And so the family erected a monument on the side of the battlefield, and then they buried an empty casket in Beacon Hill in Boston. And a fun story: when he marched out of Boston in the opening of the movie, when they recruit the regiment, Gould Shaw diverted the parade of the regiment past his girlfriend's house so he could march past her house and salute her. And her brother was with her and watched the whole thing happen. Her brother was future Republican Senator and Secretary of State Henry Cabot Lodge. And so Henry Cabot Lodge's older sister dated Robert Gould Shaw, who died commanding the 54th Massachusetts. So Glory is one of the best Civil War movies, in my opinion. It's not, some of the details are not totally accurate, but sort of my philosophy with historical movies also is when you approach a subject like a war, you can invent a fictional character and put him into real events in order to sort of portray those events reasonably well. And if you basically get all those details right, like, it's not a bad movie, especially if it gets people into the head of thinking like, this is how this occurred. This is what a regiment of black troops are experiencing, like dealing with racism in the ranks, dealing with racism from their superiors as well as the Confederates they fought. And so Glory, in that sense, hits all the right notes. There's no horribly bad that I'm aware of historical inaccuracies in that movie. And so, in my opinion, Glory is probably the best Civil War movie I could name. And we should mention, by the way, Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, based on the Jeff Sharon novels, are execrably bad. Gettysburg has the opening scene of Gettysburg, where it features a map illustrating the Gettysburg campaign. That's some of the worst cinema I've ever seen in my life. It's completely factually inaccurate. Everything about that movie is wrong. The entire structure of the Gettysburg campaign, illustrated by Gettysburg, is simply made up out of whole cloth. Right? It's nothing to do with the truth. And Gods and Generals presents a very sanitized view of the Confederacy in 1861 and 2 that just removes slavery from the table entirely. It doesn't talk about anything. There's a horrible scene in Gettysburg where a runaway slave meets the Irish sergeant of one of the Union regiments at Gettysburg, 20th Maine, commanded by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, fought on the very south end of the Union line on the first and second day, in the middle of the line on the third day. And Chamberlain got the Medal of Honor for Gettysburg, actually, and they started trying to figure out what to do with this black guy. And the Irish sergeant essentially espouses this anti-racist sentiment where he's like, "Oh, you got to treat people the same. You got to take every person as they come. You can't judge people based on their ethnicity or their characteristics." And it's totally what you would want to hear someone say in 2020. He's absolutely correct. You can't judge people as part of a group. On the other hand, having an Irish American sergeant say that in 1863 could not be more factually incorrect. It could not be. If the guy had gone off on a rant about space aliens, that scene would have been more accurate. And so Gettysburg and Gods and Generals is the prequel that takes place in 1861 and 1862. They present a completely sort of sepia tone version of the Civil War that's not really accurate in any meaningful way. And so I would not recommend those two movies. It's a shame. Gettysburg does depict some of the combat relatively well, but the sort of the kind of structure of the story, the kind of story it's trying to tell is bad. And it's really bad.
Okay, just a reminder to people who are just tuning in and watching, if you have a movie that was based on history that you would like Matt to talk about, please mention it in the comments. So far, only Hawk is talking in the comments, and his next movie is Caligula.
I mean, of course. I mean, to be honest, I don't know about Caligula as much as I could.
It has Malcolm McDowell.
It does have Malcolm McDowell. He's pretty good. He's a super nice guy. I met him one time. And he was super charming and like a decent guy. So I mean, that's Hawk was there when we met him, actually. So he would remember that. And the problem with Caligula is that you got the Roman problem, which is to say that so much of the early history of the empire is based off of things like Suetonius, which is it's sort of just a catalog of horrible things the early Roman and the Julio-Claudian emperors did. That it's hard to know how much that's accurate, right? I mean, even Livy, in his history of the founding of the city of Rome, admits that when in the Goths invaded in the 4th century, they torched the archives in Rome. So he says, my first volume of my history of the city of Rome is based entirely off of folk tales, basically. There's no actual documentation for anything. So the 7 Roman kings that we know so much about, Numa Pompilius and Tullus Hostilius, and all of these guys, Romulus, all of the stories we get from Livy, which is our authoritative source, are based off of basically folk tales. And he admits that like that's the best he could do because there were paper archives, there were documents, they're gone, right? And so the same thing is true when you're getting your history of the Julio Claudius from Suetonius. He's not inclined to treat them with a certain amount of decency because maybe they were as bad as you think, or maybe instead he's playing it up for the camera, right? And so I think Caligula emphasizes the horribleness of Caligula, which is not hard to do. Admittedly, it's not hard to do.
Okay. Teresa asks, or actually she says, all things Ken Burns are magical.
I mean, Ken Burns, like he's made, okay, so the Civil War is the touchstone that got him introduced to the American public. The Civil War has been an incredibly controversial miniseries. I think, broadly speaking, it's pretty good. Millions of people watched it. It stimulated interest in American history. As a teacher, you can't be mad about that. But he also does tend to play the sort of both sides kind of equal thing. He spent a ton of time interviewing Shelby Foote, who was a sort of romantic apologist for the Confederacy. And so there's been a pretty serious amount of criticism about the portrayal of some of the racial politics of his miniseries. He also defended himself fairly, I think, by pointing out that, like, at the end of the day, he couldn't cover everything. Eric Foner, who was one of the great historians of Reconstruction and also the former stepfather of Maggie and Jake Gyllenhaal and a president of the American Historical Association, Foner criticized him for not including Reconstruction. And Ken Burns was like, bro, I didn't have an extra 4 hours to cover the miniseries, right? Like at some point I had to call it a day, and it was not called the Civil War and Reconstruction. It was called the Civil War. And I have a book of essays where Ken Burns responded to critics who wrote essays sort of critiquing the Civil War. And some of the people basically called him a racist for not like portraying Reconstruction. And it's like, that seems unfair because that's a whole separate other topic that arguably deserves its own miniseries. So like, it's not really fair to sort of critique that. And so if you watch the Civil War as a way to sort of get interested in what happened, as opposed to the be all and end all, it's not bad. And he does open it with a discussion of slavery, and he does talk about all of the big points, and he uses paired perspectives. He talks about there's a guy named, I forget his name, but he wrote a memoir called Company H, Sam something. He's a Confederate soldier, and he uses that guy a lot to illustrate events in the Confederate Army and stuff. So it's not bad, but it does fall into the sort of like romanticizing the Confederacy a little bit.
How about John Jakes with North and South?
That's kind of the same thing. I mean, he's got like the family divided in half, and so it's
Samuel Watkins.
Sam Watkins, Company H. And he's got a Union guy who fought against Watkins a bunch that periodically he drops in on the two of them in the series. The interesting thing about North and South is when it came out, it's like in the 70s and 80s, right? If it came out now, how much different would it be? Right?
Oh, totally.
It would be, you wouldn't write the same book,
different.
Right? And it would have a lot more characters of color. It would discuss that stuff a lot more. And so that's, I think, the thing with Ken Burns. Like it did come out in the 30 years ago. It came out in 1991. So I mean, it was a while ago. But I have a with that.
How would you juxtapose that to Vietnam?
Well, Vietnam I thought was superb. Like,
right, but that's the one that just came out.
Let me wrap up the Civil War. I would say that like I have the book of essays that Ken Burns wrote a response to, and he kind of defended himself fairly. He was like, look, guys, Reconstruction was not really part of the story I wanted to tell. It deserves its own miniseries, but like don't criticize me for not including it, right? I mean, like, come on. And at some point he's like, I just had to. PBS wanted a Civil War miniseries, so that's what I did, right? Having said that, some of his other stuff is superb. The Roosevelts he did about Eleanor Theodore Franklin, those excellent. It was excellent. He did one based on Daniel Oakrin's book about Prohibition called The Last Call. It was superb. It's very short, 2-3 episodes. That was amazing. The Vietnam War was as good as you could have. If I had enough time in my classes, I would just show that miniseries because it's like 12 hours long. But it really, and the amazing thing about the Vietnam War is he interviewed everybody. He talks to people who were in the army of the South Vietnamese Republic. He talks to North Vietnamese former communist officials. He talks to like CIA guys. He talks to people who served in the Army and the Marines, the United States. And so that is really a masterpiece.
I remember when that came out, your parents watched it and they had a very hard time because they lived through that, and they said it was so realistic.
I mean,
that they were
my
having
mom was
flashbacks.
like kind of fascinated, but I was like, I already did this. I don't need to see it again, like up close. I don't need to. But yeah, I have the Vietnam War on Blu-ray, and it's excellent. It's superb. It was on Netflix for a while, but if people are interested in the Vietnam War, that's a really, and he ties up everything. He's got the protest movement, the relationship to civil rights, the American domestic politics of it, the fighting on both sides. He talks a ton about the communist government's internal politics. He talks about the rise of Le Duan versus the fall of Giap and Ho Chi Minh as the war went on. He talks about the involvement of the Russians. I mean, there's basically nothing he doesn't hit in that.
Do you think that was able to be better just because of the more recentness of it?
Yeah.
It happened while television was a thing.
Oh, yeah,
There's still people alive who
He
experienced
invented
it.
the Ken Burns effect to do the photos and stuff.
Yes, I've used that.
Which
sadly.
is superb,
It's-
right? But yeah, at some level, he was stuck getting interpretation from historians. So he had to interview Barbara J. Fields and Shelby Foote for the Civil War and a few others. But with the Vietnam War, he didn't really so much talk to historians. He avoided doing that. He does some, but not much. But he actually interviewed legit people. I mean, he's got this.
lived it.
Yeah, he's got a bunch of guys that were in the Marines, in the Army. He's got some Vietnamese people, some of whom immigrated to the States, some of whom lived in Vietnam still, that he went over there and they filmed interviews with them. Like, he's got a lady who was a young woman in the Vietnam War who's like a civilian. So she sort of describes the disruption of Vietnamese society. So I think that one is arguably, as I've seen, his magnum opus. That the Civil War was good, but the Vietnam War was as perfect as it could be. And of course, tellingly, the Civil War is a lot more touchy of a subject in the sense of the racial politics of the Civil War are very complicated. The Vietnam War
even still
doesn't.
today, we have people who
It wasn't about slavery. It wasn't.
It's not about slavery. The South will rise again.
Confederate.
Yeah, the
Yeah, I
Vietnam
can't
War-
say words either.
The Vietnam War doesn't have that sort of that baggage to go with it. But yeah, I thought the Vietnam War was superb. There's a book that went with it that I have, but I have not read. And so, but yeah, I would think the Vietnam War. And again, shout out to Last Call, the one he did about Prohibition, which was superb, was great. And it's only like 2 hours long. It's like four short episodes about the rise of Prohibition sentiment, the establishment of the law, its enforcement, and then the collapse of it.
Well,
in the
and
30s.
thank goodness that didn't stick around, or else we wouldn't be here today.
Bing, bing. Yeah, you're right about that. You want to pick some off the list, or we got comments?
Well, Hawk asks about Gladiator, and Chrissy asks if Gods of Egypt counts as history.
Oh my
I'm gonna
God,
vote
no! It's a bunch of white dudes. Okay, like the Chadwick Boseman was in Gods of Egypt, so they got like one black guy at least. They hired a black guy, and then arguably, of course, there's the huge debate: are the Egyptians actually black? Right? Maybe they are more Middle Eastern Semitic. Maybe they're more like Arabic. But either way, like one of the guys was the dude from Game of Thrones who played Jaime Lannister. Who's
Castor Wallet.
No, he's
no.
got that.
he's like Danish.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I can't think of
Nikolai Kostler.
Yes.
Waldo.
That's what I was trying to say.
He's legit white European. So it's whatever the Gods of Egypt actually looked like. They didn't look like the white
No.
guy. Like, he
Yeah,
was white.
they didn't look Danish.
Like arguably Chadwick Boseman would have been considered by the Egyptians to be like a Nubian. They would have probably called a Nubian from south of the third cataract of the Nile. But like, are there not Arabs in the world? Like, you can't go find some Israelis or some Arabs, Palestinians or something and hire them for your freaking movie? And the answer is apparently no.
I mean, Gal Gadot
Gadot
would
would have done
attest
it.
to the fact that there are plenty.
Is there not a single Arab actor in the world that you could hire? I mean, there's not even an Arab dude from like France or something. He's someone who even looks remotely Middle Eastern. And so that movie is so I've never seen it, and it's I literally have Egyptian art on the walls of my home.
Well, actually, they're right there because I've rearranged the
but
furniture.
I have Egyptian objects, the art in the china cabinets, and I'm not even going to bother seeing. It's nonsense. It's horrific.
Well, literally, it's true.
It's true. It's true.
Like, there's some right next to the place we're filming.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And we forgot, and there's some up there by the
There is some right there. There's Egyptian art right there on the mantelpiece. Yeah.
Yes, they can't see that.
No.
They can see our lovely DVD obsolete collection.
It's not obsolete at all. It plays on this DVD player just fine.
That's not even hooked up to TV.
Whatever.
Okay, you can go back to Gladiator, or you can pretend that it doesn't exist.
I mean,
or-
look.
Pretend it doesn't
So
exist.
what can we say about Gladiator? It portrays the relationship between Marcus Aurelius and Commodus wrong. So there's that. It invents a fictional character to tell a story, which is like whatever. The fighting in the opening scene between the Romans and the the Gauls is okay. Although I'd have to check and see the Roman cavalry that Maximus Decimus Meridius is the command of. I think they had stirrups on their horses, which is of course wrong. They wouldn't have had this for like a couple hundred years. Although I got to check. I'd have to check. Some of the fighting in the arena appears reasonable. Although I will note that they hired a swordsman to train all the actors in sword fighting, and we don't have Roman swordsmanship manuals. And so they had to train them in like a martial arts kind of sword fighting that they made up because we don't have documentation as to how the Romans taught people how to fight with swords. So they basically worked backward from the gladius they issued the gladiators. And they're like, well, how would you fight with this? I guess we'll just come up with something. And so I spilled wine on myself.
And how would that relate to like the eagle?
Oh, the Eagle of the Ninth the Eagle of the Ninth is a great book. It's called The Eagle, I think is the name of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's based off a novel called The Eagle of the Ninth. It's about a Roman centurion whose father disappeared north of Hadrian's Wall, and he's posted there as a centurion in command of a legion.
For some of our fans who are not as familiar with geography, the Hadrian's Wall is between
England and Scotland.
England
It was the Roman military formation that marked the northern border. The Limae is the Latin word for border. It's the Limae of Britannia, the Roman province of Britain, as to distinguish itself from Pictland, which is they called the Scotland, right? And so
I'm just covering my bases.
And so he ends up going fighting detachments of Picts, Scots, and then he goes on an adventure north of the Wall. That's a cool adventure story, and it's a bunch of cool novels. The lady that wrote it wrote like 4 or 5 novels about the same characters. That the fighting in that's very accurate. There's a scene in the beginning where they fight some Celts actually, led by Druid, who's been riding them up against Roman rule. It was really good, and the fighting is accurate. There's only one really big battle scene in The Gladiator. It's the first one where they fight the Gauls.
Gladiator.
Gladiator. Yeah, but the arena combat's okay. So it's okay, but not great. It's not, and of course, a lot of the rest of the stuff in that is there's better movies to watch about Rome.
So how about Rome then?
Rome is on there. Rome is superb. Rome's 2 seasons. It was on HBO. You can get on any of the HBO stuff. It's a fictional story about the story is real. It's about Caesar's ascent to power and his destruction of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. But it invents 2 fictional characters, Lucius Vorenus and also Titus Pullo, who are centurions, officers in the in the Legion Gallica that Caesar takes back from Gaul across the Rubicon when he attacks Rome and seizes power. And then it's about the maneuverings that result in the politics. And it's a bunch of real people are in it. Caesar's wife is in it. Brutus and his mother are in it. Also, Mark Antony is in it. Octavian is in it. And
Cleopatra.
I was just going to say,
Cleopatra's in it famously. And memorably, it weaves the stories of Pullo and Vorenus as guys who sort of were in Caesar's legion with like the consequences of Caesar's actions, and it depicts pretty accurately the civil war between Caesar and Pompey that results in Caesar's ascent to power and the death of Pompey. And so it's pretty reasonably accurate in terms of the politics. And the cool thing, as I mentioned about Rome, is that the main characters are fake, but they're realish people. They could have been real. We don't know the names of every centurion in the Gallica Legion. So inventing these 2 sort of fictional characters as a way to tell the story was fun. And there's just some stellar scenes. There's a scene where Pullo is going to be executed and has judicial combat. He agrees to fight the gladiator hired by the court to kill criminals. And the idea is if you kill the gladiator, you win. If he kills you, you're guilty. And there's just a tremendously great scene. There's some wonderful battle sequences, and all of the equipment, the clothing is very accurate. They built in Italy they took a back street, sort of like a 4 square block radius, and turned it into downtown Rome, circa 1st century BC. And you can't beat it. The realism of that show is superb. And so if you want to watch something good about ancient Rome, that's the thing to watch. There isn't anything better you could watch that I know of about ancient Rome than that.
Did you see Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor?
Yes, that was a hot mess.
You know they're redoing it with Gal Gadot.
I mean, hopefully it's better than the Elizabeth Taylor one, because Elizabeth Taylor one was like, I like Elizabeth Taylor. She's.
But it was all about Elizabeth.
Yeah,
Taylor.
it was basically Elizabeth Taylor in a movie
really
where the camera's going to linger prominently on Elizabeth Taylor for most of the film, and then we got some guys painted in gold or some shit. I don't even know. Right? It's just some dudes in togas in the back or whatever. Who cares? And so mostly Elizabeth Taylor was underserved by the movie she was in, which cared more about how hot she was than any acting talent or script writing that they may have cared to display.
Christy also brings up a couple of other, I can talk, I speak, She says Raiders of the Lost Ark, National Treasure, and History of the World Part 1.
I mean, History of the World Part 1 is a modern classic. I call my World Civ syllabi. I put the History of the World Part 1 on the World Civ 1 syllabi. No one ever gets it. No one ever notices that I called the class. Nobody ever know. Raiders of the Lost Ark is a garbage movie. I mean, The Big Bang Theory popularized this, but it was true before. If Indiana Jones had done nothing, the Nazis probably would have found the Ark of the Covenant. They would have taken it back to Berlin. They would have opened it, and a bunch of the leaders of the Nazis would have their faces melted off, right? So Indiana Jones preventing the Nazis from doing that, I mean, that's a crappy thing, right? And there's, by the way, my least favorite historical inaccuracy in that movie is when he goes to the secret submarine base, and it's like, I guess, in Corfu or in Crete or whatever, and he holds them hostage with the rocket launcher. The rocket launcher he's using is a shoulder-fired rocket-propelled grenade launcher. It's a Soviet RPG-7 from like the 1960s. And so what is he doing with the Soviet RPG-7 in the 1960s? If he was using a disposable, the Germans had disposable rocket launchers, anti-tank weapons called Panzerfaust. But by the end of the war, they were also using a bazooka-like one called Panzerschreck. They could have gotten him a Panzerschreck. The reason they didn't is because Steven Spielberg's dumb, but also the Panzerschreck has a big blast shield to protect you from the exhaust that when you hold it up, it would have hidden Harrison Ford's face. And so I guess they went with the RPG-7, but it's completely inaccurate. That wasn't a weapon. It didn't exist for like 25 years. More than that even, because the movie's in like the 30s. And so Raiders of the Lost Ark is a garbage movie. The best one of the three is, of course, Last Crusade. We don't mention the fourth one, which I'd rather punch myself in the face than see that garbage again. Is disappointed that it even existed. And a criminal waste of the talents of Cate Blanchett, who was the one-dimensional commie spy in that movie. So we just don't mention that.
Do you want to talk about National
Not
Treasure?
really. Whatever. It's a hilarious romp through the Dan Brown conspiracy theory version of American history.
That's not Dan Brown.
Stage. He didn't write it, but he might as well have. Right? Fun. But
Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown.
Whatever. Give me some off the list.
Well, I feel bad here because Teresa brings up Schindler's List, which is an amazing movie, but I haven't gotten you to watch it yet.
I've seen like parts of that, but I've never sat through the whole thing. Schindler's List is pretty accurate. I mean, it depicts reasonably accurately Oskar Schindler, who ran the factory and then used the employment of Jews in the factory as a way to save them from being sent to the camps. And in fact, if you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., he's on the wall there, and they honor him. Yad Vashem is one of the righteous among the nations. Who saved a bunch of Jews he didn't have to. He could have just exploited them ruthlessly for their labor and let them all die, but he didn't. He saved a bunch of people's lives. And so that movie is actually pretty accurate. I would argue that that's probably the best movie Steven Spielberg ever made.
It's hard to watch, though.
Oh, yeah, it's not exactly an up movie, right?
Jewish.
The first time I went out with Dara, we went with a friend and saw The Pianist, and afterwards she's like, yeah, you didn't say anything. I'm like, well, what was The Pianist? We're sitting in the car on the way home, and like, wow, it was a depressing movie. Where Vladislav Spielman spent, 4 years in the Warsaw Ghetto and nearly starved to death like 10 times. So it wasn't exactly like a fun movie, but it was, of course, Oscar nominated, I think. In terms of Holocaust movies, there are good ones and bad ones. Schindler's List is one of the better ones.
Took me a long time to watch.
No, it's not an easy movie.
It's a good movie. I will get Matt to watch it in its entirety one of these days.
Yeah,
it's also hard to watch that one these days because it's not really appropriate for our 6-year-old, and it's very long.
Yeah, that's not an easy movie to fit into. You can't just throw that up on an afternoon and get on the couch and watch it.
And I'm not putting it on at 9 p.m. after we finally get her to bed.
That's not happening.
Mel Brooks.
Mel Brooks is, of course. How can you go wrong with my favorite scene in cinema? I think maybe is the Last Supper, where he comes in, he's like, Judas, super salad, right? And I mean, you just can't beat that stuff, right? Or the scene in the French Revolution, right? Is Mel Brooks accurate? He's trying to be funny more than accurate, but
can you say anything about the satire? Because not History of the World +1, but Blazing Saddles, where he talks about racism at a time that people were not.
I mean, and those movies are not accurate factually, but they're accurate thematically, I guess you can say, right? I mean, there's the scene in History of the World Part 1 where he's King Louis the 16th, I guess, and he's playing chess with people, right? I mean, not real, but on the other hand, is a symbolism of the rampant excess of the Ancien regime in France. You can't go wrong with that, right? And I mean, how many times do you have to explain something to people about the monarchy where you say, well, I mean, it's good to be the king, right? Because it is, right?
So we're having a lot of chatter about people loving the Inquisition song
The Inquisition
and
song is
Torquemada.
fantastic. I mean, how about when they drop the nuns who were the synchronized swimmers, and they drop the Jews in, and the Jewish men are like flailing around with their heavy beards and stuff, and they're all confused, and they're like getting shot out of the water slide while the nuns come. I mean, only Mel Brooks would have the comedic genius to think of something. So,
I mean, and the producers.
The producers is, I mean, how can you go wrong with the producers? And frankly, the original movie was not very good. The stage play was superb. The film adaptation was okay, but not great. It was. I mean, if you can find a recording of the stage play was, and the songs are just
The original
amazing.
movie was better. Zero Marcel.
I didn't like the original movie. I saw it one time. I didn't like it.
I loved
Like my
it.
parents, by the way, saw it in Broadway. The original cast: Nathan Lane, Matthew Broderick, and they came home, called me up, and my dad was like, "Oh my god, it was so great!" And I was like, "Why didn't you tell me you were going?" He's like, "Yeah, we left Friday night. We came home just now, Sunday afternoon." And I'm like, "I would have driven up to go to like do that." And he's like, "Oh yeah, you probably could have. Oh well, sorry." But they had a great time and said it was really great. So but yeah, the stage play was I thought superb. And even if you could just go on like YouTube and find the music, the songs are great. I mean, you would not think a satire about Adolf Hitler, a gay romp through Berchtesgaden with Adolf and Eva would work, but it's just transcendent. And they've got the women coming down with the giant pretzels, and the women coming down decorated with their bras, beer steins. I mean, it's over the top, but it's Mel Brooks. Yeah.
Yeah, there's more amusement about Piss Boy, and then it evolves into Monty Python.
Monty Python. Some of Monty Python. I mean, the best way to explain some aspects of 19th century revolutionary Russian social thought is the scene where King Arthur's beating the crap out of the peasant, and the peasants say like,
I'm being oppressed.
Witness the violence inherent in the system. And that's what the 19th century Russians were trying to do is exacerbate the inherent inequality in the system as a way to mobilize the rest of the masses, right? As a revolutionary vanguard would expose the inherent violence of the system as a way to politicize the masses and then lead them to revolution. It's like there's no better way than to illustrate that scene where the guy's getting beat up, yelling, "Look at everyone! Look what this guy's doing to me."
Do we want to go back to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
I mean, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Is it accurate in terms of the Great Depression? Thematically, yes and no. It's a wonderful retelling of the Odyssey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although some parts of it are the scene at the end where the politician comes in and says, "I belong to a certain secret society. I do not think I need to share its name." That was accurate, right? I mean, for generations, Hugo Black, who was one of the majority of the Supreme Court who voted in favor of Brown v. Board in 1954, 1955, he had been in the Klan, and he defended himself by saying it wasn't so much that we cared a lot necessarily about going out and doing bad things to black people, is that any politician in the state of Alabama to go anywhere, that was the only networking opportunity in town, right? And so that guy sort of argued that I'm in this, we all know what it is, right? And the sort of ubiquitousness of that kind of racism in the South before the civil rights movement, that's pretty accurate, right? But other than that, when you watch Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, remember you're not watching so much a story about the 1930s in America as you are about 13th century BC
Ulysses.
Mediterranean, right? It's a retelling of the Odyssey. Which is good
You
stuff.
can go to Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird.
I mean, that one I do not have down. I mean, if you want to put some off the list.
I mean, to me, that was the ultimate civil.
Well, I mean,
Right.
that was it was.
Do you want the good, the okay, or the bad?
I mean, just pick one and then cross it off when I talk about it.
Marie Antoinette.
Okay, so Marie Antoinette is so I gave Dare this list and I divided them into good, bad, and okay. And so the good movies are good because they're accurate and they tell a good story and whatever. The bad movies are bad because they're stupid. The okay movies are not totally accurate, but they sort of get some parts of it right and are worth watching for that reason. And so Marie Antoinette is a very controversial movie in that sense. So Kirsten Dunst stars as the Austrian princess who comes in the 1770s and marries the King Louis XVI of France. They have a bunch of kids, and then the revolution happens. They end up dead. They end up getting executed. He gets executed in 1793. She gets executed later that year. Their kids die. His brothers eventually succeed to the throne after the revolution. Their execution was seen as being the beginning of this violent moment in French history. And so the movie stars her as the young kind of teenage princess who was first coming to Versailles and sort of living this kind of life, right? And Sofia Coppola made the movie, and she made the movie in a way she sort of, it was sort of like about kind of like a Paris Hilton type of character, like a sort of socialite kind of celebutante person. That's the sort of theme that she kind of went after. And a few things she said about the movie: the costumes are absolutely perfect. The setting is, they filmed it in Versailles for the first time. The French government let them film a movie in Versailles, which is amazing.
They did a lot of restoration.
They did it. They cleaned the movie, paid to clean stuff up so they could then film it, and then they left it that way. And so some of the thematic choices are odd. It's all punk rock music because it's sort of the attitude of Marie Antoinette, right? So you got to kind of roll with that a little bit. And the one thing that's people criticize is it takes a lot of the historical context away. There are these scenes where footmen dressed in the frock coats and stuff carry in pictures of Marie Antoinette with the stuff people are saying about her written on the bottom of the picture, and that's really your only glimpse of the wider world of what's going on in revolutionary France. Like, why is this happening? And they're not really clear about that. That's definitely a criticism. But in terms of the portrayal of some of the major life events in Marie Antoinette, it's absolutely accurate. And it ends at a crucial moment when the revolution has begun, and they take her and Louis back to the Tuileries in downtown Paris, from which they will eventually try to escape to Austria, which will be the thing that leads to their execution. So it kind of stops right at the point where it begins to get interesting. But as a portrayal of what court life in Versailles was like, as a portrayal of Marie Antoinette's naivete and the difficulty she had fitting in with the French court, it is superb. Right, the scene where they bring her from Austria as part of this marriage pact between Louis XVI's grandfather, Louis XV, and also Marie Antoinette's mother, Maria Theresa. They bring her to this tent on the Franco-Austrian border, which is, they have it on both sides of the border. And she walks in, and when they get her to the middle of the tent, they take off all of her clothes, and they dress her like a French noblewoman. And they take this very plain kind of dowdy dress, and they pin up her hair and lots of makeup, and they put up the dress with the push-up décolletage and everything. And they dress her like a French noblewoman. And she's got a little dog, and they take the dog away. The dog is called Mops, real thing. Marie Antoinette had a dog named Mops. And she says, "What about my dog?" They're like, "We'll get you a French dog." And the symbolism is she's entering the tent as an Austrian princess, and she's leaving it as a French princess, right? She's going to come out the other side in France, having sort of given herself to the new country that she's going to live in. And of course, she's a little kid. She's like 15 when this happens. And so that was really spot on. And again, some of the details are a little off, and the music and stuff really can kind of set people's nerves on edge. But in terms of sort of what was it like to be Marie Antoinette, like, that's a really good movie. That movie really nails it.
That's the one where she has to greet the king's court.
Madame de Pompadour.
Yeah,
Madame
so
Dubarry,
then those are the last words I shall ever say to her.
So the king has a mistress, Louis XV has a mistress, Madame de Dubarry. He had a big one, Madame de Pompadour, but she got syphilis and died. And so Marie Antoinette comes from a very Catholic background. She's not the king's wife. The king hated his wife. She was awful. They had a whole thing. But it was a hugely embarrassing thing that the new Dauphinée, the crown princess, wouldn't talk to Madame de Barry. And after a huge kind of scandal at court, they eventually convinced Marie Antoinette to do it. So she's walking one day in the Hall of Mirrors. She stops in front of Madame de Barry, and she says, "There are a lot of people at Versailles today." And of course, Madame de Barry says, "Oh, of course, Your Grace, there's so many." And then Marie Antoinette says, "Huh," and just walks away. But of course, she's acknowledged in public that this woman is sort of a semi-official, a position as the Mistress de Chambre, the mistress of the bedchamber of the king. And so it's a telling moment because Marie Antoinette, for all of the reported stories of her libidinous attitudes, was in fact somewhat prudish. Grew up in a very stodgy Austrian court where, that kind of thing was totally frowned upon. And so there were all these stories about how she had lesbian orgies and engaged in all sorts of terrible stuff. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. She would never have done any of that because that's not the kind of upbringing that she had, right? Mm-hmm. So you strike that one off the list. I recommend that one. Thematically perfect in terms of plot depiction. You could leave some to be desired.
Amadeus.
Amadeus. Have you seen Amadeus?
Oh yeah. Amadeus is. Depicting Mozart as a genius, great. Depicting Salieri as his inevitable rival, it plays it up a lot. F. Murray Abraham hammed it up in order to be the bad guy, but that wasn't really their relationship. It wasn't really the case. And so Amadeus is not the most accurate of historical movies.
All right, let's do a good one. Hamilton.
I mean, of course, Hamilton definitely had to be included. So what you say about Hamilton, arguably, I would say Hamilton should be in the good category because he does get some things wrong. The portrayal of Hamilton's wife as having been forced by her father to marry for station, totally false. She had a brother. It was assumed that she did not inherit anything. She was not. That was not how it was going to be. Angelica Charlotte didn't do any of that, right? And some of the stuff, the relationship between Hamilton and Burr, I get why Lin-Manuel Miranda made it span the whole of Hamilton's career to make Burr a recurring character. But that's
Burr is the narrator.
Yeah, it's not exactly. And then, yeah, you can argue that part of what it is Burr is an unreliable narrator who inserts himself in. He inserts himself into Hamilton's life more to tell the story. So who lives, who dies, who tells your story? Well, Burr is telling the story. Burr is the guy providing the frame story about how, that's true. But in reality, Burr and Hamilton's passing across so much. And we should mention, the part that I like, though, is if you listen to the second half of it, the cabinet debates between Hamilton and Jefferson about the assumption of state debts, the relationship of America to the French Revolution, those are really spot on. I mean, there's, both of them together are probably 7 or 8 minutes long, and yet they pretty much neatly encapsulate many of the political differences between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the late 1700s. You can't do it better. I mean, I can't explain that in the same length of time any better than he could with a rap. And so those are really superb. That is really some of the best writing you could see.
Critical question. Did Martha Washington name her federal tomcat after him?
That was a wonderful story that was advanced, much like the story Marie Antoinette sang to the peasants, if they don't have bread, why don't they eat cake, which was created in the 1830s by a hostile historian of the Revolution. The story that Hamilton was the namesake of Martha Washington's tomcat who impregnated all the female cats is not true, although hilarious. Right? The story is that there was a tomcat at Mount Vernon who impregnated all of the other female cats, and Martha Washington used to jokingly refer to the cat as Alexander Hamilton, given Hamilton's notable libidinous proclivities. But having said that, not an accurate story, but a funny one.
Tim asks about Titanic.
Oh, what a shitty movie.
I didn't like it.
No, it was terrible. I mean, okay, for starters, let's talk about all the things wrong with Titanic. Okay, for starters, she throws like $120 million. Bill Paxton spends the whole movie saying, I'm looking for this necklace. And she's like, I hope you find it. At the end of the movie, she's like, into the North Atlantic. I mean, you lady. Like, you could have given it to him. He'll go to a museum, right? Now it's at the bottom of the Atlantic. Great, thanks for that. Right?
But, I mean, her whole life is at the bottom of the Atlantic.
What you got to do Bill Paxton dirty like that? What did he do to you? It took you
made her relive all of those terrible memories.
Isn't that good, though? Didn't she want... And okay, second of all, let's go back a little bit. The door would hold 2 people, Rose. The door would hold 2 people.
They have concretely confirmed that.
The Mythbusters, who are significantly bigger guys than either young Kate Winslet or young Leonardo DiCaprio, they climbed on the door and floated in San Francisco Bay for like an hour. And so, well after Lightoller brought back the boats to look for people, which is to display it. And Lightoller shoots himself in the movie. He didn't. He came back. He brought the boats back. It wasn't Kathy Bates plays the unsinkable Molly Brown. She didn't do that. It was Lightoller. He took the boats and loaded one of them fully and sent the rest back. And he lived long enough, by the way, to participate in the small boat evacuation in 1940 at Dunkirk. He took a boat over and he rescued people at Dunkirk. And so he didn't shoot himself on the deck of the Titanic.
So do you want to talk about Dunkirk?
We can get there.
Okay.
Yeah. But also, the biggest problem with Titanic is just that if you watch the scenes where Kate Winslet's out on the deck with, what's his name, Billy Zane, it was so cold on the deck of the Titanic that they would have been wrapped in heavy jackets, which they didn't do because you can't make your actors film like that. And also we can't have Kate Winslet like wrapped in a scarf with only her eyes visible delivering lines. It doesn't work, right? And other than that, the contrived love story, rich girl, poor boy, whatever, it's romantic, my father and I criticizing it in the movie theater in 1998 got the hostile attention of an extensive crowd of teenage girls there for their
Did it come out in 1988?
Whenever it came out.
I was in high school.
Yeah, it was 1988. I was in high school too.
You were not in high school in
I graduated
1988.
in the spring of 1998. So I was in high school.
98.
Yeah, 98.
You're saying 88.
No, 98. 98.
He is saying 88.
Yeah, 98. But a bunch of
I'm like, you're
okay, all right. A bunch of girls on like 17th viewing got like super mad, so my dad and I shut up about the movie until we got
because
back
they're
to the
just
car.
there for Leo.
They just want to see Leonardo DiCaprio and by the way, the best meme I've seen in the recent years is like draw me like one of your French girls. It's a horrible drawing. Somebody posted one, paint me like one of your Warhammer figurines. It's fantastic. But in terms of love story, A+. In terms of story accuracy, like C-. It's, right. Not. The ship sank. It did sink. Okay, but some of the details were not great.
What's C plus C?
Okay, we got Titanic. Do you want to go back to Dunkirk, or you want me to give you a different one?
I mean, Dunkirk is okay. In terms of actualizing the experiences of the British soldiers on the beach, Dunkirk is superb. In terms of being a concrete depiction of the entire events, it's not very good. But Nolan himself argued it's not a war movie; it's a survival movie about people getting through this experience, right? So that's better. It's good for that. If you watch Dunkirk, you may not know everything that happened, like you read a book or something, but you would get a feel of how terrifying it was and how confusing and chaotic it was. The scenes in the beginning with the French guys who are not exactly sure what to do, but are like, get out of here, English guy, I guess we're fighting Nazis or something, where our government has fallen and we don't know. And the heroism of the small boat evacuation. And the scene in the end where the British soldiers expect to be greeted as losers and instead are given cheers because they are they're the first time that Hitler has suffered anything resembling a setback since the war began almost a year ago. That stuff's like accurate. That stuff is pretty accurate.
Okay, I'm going to jump around in history. Let's talk about The Messenger.
So The Messenger is actually a personal favorite. It's a movie by Luc Besson, who made The Fifth Element. He reunites with Mila Jovovich. She stars as Joan of Arc, the maid from Orléans, right? The woman from Don Remy. And so it's the end of the 100 Years' War. France is getting its ass kicked, and Joan of Arc has visions that impel her to go to the Dauphin, Charles, and let him give her permission to lead his armies in victory against the hated English. Some of the movie is not accurate. The opening scene where the village that Joan of Arc lives in is raided by English is inaccurate. It was raided by Burgundians, and Joan of Arc wasn't in the village. They fled to the woods. They just watched it get burned and then rebuilt it. Not accurate. The scene where she finds the sword as a young girl is not accurate. She found it on the road to Chinon, one of the battles. She said she had visions at age 13. The movie depicts it as much younger, as a young girl. She's getting visions of Jesus in the woods. Not accurate. But the depiction of the medieval warfare that is offered in the siege of Orleans, the siege of Rouen, I think it is, and also Paris, you can't beat that. There's a solid 45, 50 minutes in the middle of the movie, which is just unrelenting medieval warfare, and it's absolutely as brutal as I've ever seen, and you could not do better than that, right? And then the scene at the end where they put her on trial for heresy is a little contrived, but it's a good, in my opinion, it's one of those movies that is not exactly accurate at capturing detail, but it does carry across the sort of thematic idea or the sort of feeling of what you're supposed to talk about. But again, in terms of the medieval siege warfare, the scenes where she's attacking Orleans, you can't beat them. You just can't beat them. It's fantastic.
Okay, so I'm going to let us go on for about another 45 minutes. So if you have other suggestions on movies, please comment them. Changing time periods again. Let's go to Letters from Iwo Jima and Flags of Our Fathers.
So there's two movies Clint Eastwood made together. Letters from Flags of Our Fathers, which is about the book that was written by the guys that raised the flag at Iwo Jima and what happened to them. And that movie's okay, but it's sort of schmaltzy and it's kind of about what these, one of the guys never wanted to talk about it again. His kids didn't even know. Two of the guys were sort of famous for doing it. One guy was a Native American who was probably ended up as a homeless alcoholic. And it's sort of like a, okay, sort of meh. But the pair movie he made it with, Letters from Iwo Jima, is based on a book by the Japanese general in charge of defending the island of Iwo Jima from the American attack in 1944. It was the end of the Pacific War. The Japanese are on this island. This huge American armada comes, blows the shit out of them. We capture Mount Suribachi. We raise the flag. We won. But the Japanese guys all wrote letters home, and most of them died. So the commanding general published them as a book. And Eastwood wanted to make it as one movie. where it would cut back and forth between the American and the Japanese, but it was like 7 hours. And so he cut it into 2 movies. And the Japanese movie is a surprisingly thoughtful perspective of these poor Japanese guys who are basically waiting for the hammer to drop on their faces. You know, they'd be scared conscripts dreaming of what life is like back home, knowing that one day the American Marines and Army or Navy are going to come out of the blue and just obliterate them. And they're terrified of their fanatical officers who think that they might not let them surrender, and the Americans who may kill them. And so that was a very, very good depiction, both movies together, of both sides of the Iwo Jima battle, and also to a degree its aftermath, which was pretty cool. Clint Eastwood has become infamous in recent years for his sort of weirdly conservative. You know, no one will forget the 2012 Republican National Convention where he talked to a chair supposedly with Obama in it or something. It was very weird. But seems totally normal today. I mean, in comparison to things that happened in recent years, it seems completely ordinary that someone would do that. But this was a surprisingly kind of thoughtful pair of movies. I thought Letters from Iwo Jima was very unexpected. To see an accurate presentation, depiction, perspective of the Japanese Imperial Army in World War II is unusual, and that was interesting.
Okay, staying in that time period, Tim asks about your favorite Pearl Harbor.
Michael Bay should be prosecuted for crimes against art. So Pearl Harbor is the worst movie I've ever seen.
Worse than Armageddon?
No, Armageddon's worse. You're right. Funny story. When they were making Armageddon, Ben Affleck asked him, why is it easier to train oil drillers to be astronauts instead of training astronauts to be oil drillers, right? And of course, the movie would be a lot less interesting. There's a bunch of crew-cut military astronauts learning how to operate oil drilling machinery. And Michael Bay told him, why don't you shut the fuck up? And so Ben Affleck was like, and that was the last time we talked about that. And so Armageddon is literally the worst thing that's ever been done to cinema since Lily Riefenstahl and the Triumph of the Will.
We're talking about Pearl Harbor.
But anyway, Pearl Harbor is the second worst thing since the Triumph of the Will. So Pearl Harbor, some parts of it are good. The depiction of the actual Battle of Pearl Harbor is not bad. Some of the opening scenes, the Japanese are depicted as correctly understanding that their Mark IV torpedoes don't function in the shallow water of Pearl Harbor, and they fit them with wooden engine cowlings. That's accurate. They found an island in Tokyo Bay that looked like a miniature Pearl Harbor, and they used it for attack planning. And they planned the attack using this little tiny island that was like 10 feet wide. That's accurate. It's incredible, some of the detail that is in some of these sequences. Why isn't that in the rest of the movie? So there's another scene where Jon Voight, delivering what I would consider a career worst performance as FDR, he tells the Joint Chiefs, we're going to beat these Japanese guys. And he stands up in the middle of the meeting of the cabinet, which is, by the way, extremely unusual because he's paralyzed from the waist down. And he never would have volunteered. He never would have revealed this publicly. People knew about it. He's in a wheelchair. He's not a secret. But FDR would not have drawn attention to it in that way. Also, fun story, he just can't. You just can't. The reason he's in a wheelchair is his legs don't work. And that's like why.
That's not a selective thing.
It's not like you could just flip a switch and be like, well, my legs work now. Oh, no. Like, that's not how that works. It's stupid. And so the idea that there's a scene where he's standing up and they're all like, oh, Mr. President. He's like, no, get back. I can stand up. No, you can't. He just can't do it. That's not how reality works. Michael Bay, stop it. And then there's the scene in the end where they go on the Doolittle raid. And is it Ben Affleck that dies? I think it's Ben Affleck. I don't know. But he dies in China, and Josh Hartnett gets his body, and they take it all the way down to Burma, and they go through the China-Burma-India road, and they get it across to Australia and the South Pacific to South America and up. That's how some of those guys came home. It took them like 2 years. And what, Ben Affleck's body's in a casket for 2 years? You know what a human body in a wooden casket's going to look like they get, what's her name? It's an English lady who was in all the vampire movies.
Lily James?
No. But she's the love interest there. And it's like, you really going to give her fiance's body in a wooden casket that's been in 17 months in the casket? You carried it over the Himalaya mountains? Like, you buried that shit in China, okay? And that's the stupidest thing in the world that they did that. And again, it took those guys like 2 or 3 years to get home, right? And then at the end, she's like, well, the Doolittle raid was hopeful. It would be a long time before we fought the Japanese. No, bitch, it would not be a long time. You fought them like 2 weeks later. The Doolittle raid was like April 1942. Coral Sea was like not long after. Midway was in May. You were already landing in the Solomons that month. And so it's like, it wasn't like years before you fought the Japanese. It was like weeks. Midway decisively turned the entire tide of the war. He sank 4 Japanese carriers. And she's talking about how it was a long time before we had any hope. I don't know. Sinking the mainstay of the Japanese Imperial Fleet seems pretty friggin' hopeful to me. Right? Also, Pearl Harbor reiterates the false line that Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, said, "I fear we have awoken the sleeping giant." Horseshit, he never said that. It may have accorded with the sentiment he expressed privately, but he never uttered those words. It's wrong, and this should not be in any movie. It should not. Right? It should not be in any movie. And so, not a fan of Pearl Harbor, a garbage movie. Oh, and there's a scene after the Pearl Harbor raid where they go into the hospital. The hospital nurses, by the way, 18-year-old nurses, guess they didn't go to college like every other nurse in the frigging country, right? Also, they give blood in Coke bottles. And you give blood in a Coke bottle, it's not sterile, the blood clots. That's why you give blood in plastic bags. So, in Medicine 101, apparently. So, does someone want to put Fang out? He really needs to go out. He's begging. You want to go out?
Gonna pop up.
Go out. Yeah, Papa's gonna put you out. And so, Pearl Harbor, not my favorite movie. I think Michael Bay, if I became president, I would get Michael Bay and I'd bring him to the White House and I would punch him in the face. And then I would get somebody stronger than me to punch him in the stomach for a while, and then we throw him out of the country.
So I don't know what movie to ask about next, because Chrissy asked about Braveheart, and then Tim said, sounds like I struck a nerve. How about Three Kings?
Three Kings was hilarious and is a remake of a World War II movie. And as a hilarious caper, it's just a wonderful movie. There's all those great intercuts where Ice Cube is like, do you really want to go back to your previous life? And Mark Wahlberg is like the copy repairman. He rips the thing open and spills ink all over himself. And the one guy is just standing in a backyard shooting stuffed animals. And they're both like, no, we actually don't want to go home. This is fine. Like, living in the desert and shooting people seems way better, right? And so that, as an indictment of the Bush administration's failure to come to terms with the sort of consequences of trying to unseat Saddam Hussein, it's a superb movie. I love that movie. I feel like I might even have it. I do have it. It's right there. I have it right there. It's a wonderful movie. And then somebody mentioned Braveheart.
Chrissy.
Let's talk about some Braveheart. Braveheart is an affront to everything. It's an affront to everything. So,
but you will never take my freedom.
Yeah, well, we'll just write a shitty movie and make you be in it. Okay, so Braveheart is allegedly based on a poem written in the 1300s by Henry the Blind. The problem is the titular Braveheart of the movie is Robert the Bruce, who apparently Mel Gibson decided he didn't want to be Robert the Bruce, he wanted to be William Wallace, so they wrote another movie. And it's sort of like saying, it's like naming a movie The Father of America and making it about Governor Morris. And when everyone was like, wait, isn't the Father of America George Washington? You're like, man, shut up. And so you just change it. Who cares, right? So the next thing we can mention is there's a scene in the beginning of the movie where they say, we're going to have something that we Scots people have never had, a country of our own. Well, funny story. In the mid-1300s, the early 1300s, Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, invaded Scotland. The reason he did is the independent Scottish kings had been bedeviling the English throne for hundreds of years. So when he said, we're going to have a country we've never had, what fucking country are you talking about? Scotland's a real country ruled by Scottish people since before Roman times. That's madness. You're just making shit up, right? Another thing, Stirling Bridge, Battle of Stirling Bridge, they could have shown the bridge. It was at a bridge. They don't show one. Why are they in a field if the battle is called Stirling Bridge? It should be called Stirling Field, right? No, I guess not. Also, another couple of things you mentioned. Okay, it shows one of the English nobles executing the rite of prima nocta, where on the wedding night of anybody in his domain, he can have sex with the bride. There's no evidence, none, that anybody ever did that. None. There's a consistent argument that, noblemen did that all the time. Well, if they did anybody write about it? Not till like the 1700s, so you give me a break. Also, William Wallace lives in a clay hut and speaks French, English, Scottish, and Latin. Where do you learn that? Right? He was actually a nobleman, so he didn't live in a hut. Right? That's madness. On top of that, in the final sequence, the Scottish guys are all there. They're at the battle. They've got the blue face paints called woad. They've got their tartans. They can't have bagpipes because bagpipes have been banned by the English. Bullshit. Bagpipes were never banned in Scotland ever. Ever. Second, people didn't start wearing tartans until the 1500s. And when they wore them, nobody ever wore them like William Wallace wore his. He's just wearing it wrong. One historian said it's like if you had a movie about the American Revolution that depicted George Washington wearing a three-piece business suit with the jacket backwards, right? A, it's wrong, and B, he's not even wearing it right. It's not even wearing it like it's supposed to be meant to be worn. Finally, woad was not worn by Scottish people since Roman times. So the woad is 1,000 years too late. The tartans are 300 years too early. What's this movie even? How does this even work? Right? What is even the point of this? And finally, one of my other gripes with the movie is it depicts Edward I marrying his son, Edward II, to a French princess, Isabella, the she-wolf of France, accurately. Edward's kind of a dipshit, accurately. But the final scene has Isabella whisper to the dying Edward, who did not die in bed, like the movie depicts, that I'm pregnant, but I'm not pregnant with your son's child. It's William Wallace's. All that's false, false, false. Isabella and Edward had a child, Edward III, the greatest English king, no matter what anybody says. And in fact, Isabella and her lover, John the Earl of Mortimer, jailed and executed Edward II, allegedly by shoving a red-hot poker up his ass because he was supposedly gay, only to have her son, Edward III, actually execute her lover, John the Earl of Mortimer. It's a famous scene. It's like in 30s, where he smashes the door to her bedroom with an axe. And he drags the Earl of Mortimer out, and he doesn't want his mother to see him doing it. But she says, "Spare him, spare him." And Edward says, "There can only be one king of England, mother, and it can't be this man." And so Edward III took John the Earl of Mortimer and hung him from the tower. They hung him from the Tower of London. And so nothing about that movie is accurate. It's completely fake. If they had made it a fantasy movie set in some other country, it would have been a perfectly fine movie. But to set it in England, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, come on. The Scottish kings fought the English kings for hundreds of years until the union of the two crowns in 1603 with James Stewart, and the Scots are somehow this oppressed minority. Like, the English kings got invaded multiple times by Scottish kings in the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, and into the 1600s. It was a persistent problem that the Scottish kings would ally with France and attack England simultaneously. They called it the Auld Alliance, A-U-L-D, Auld Alliance. And the English hated the fact that they had the Scots on their northern border and the French on their southeast. And the movie plays complete havoc with that. It's complete nonsense. It couldn't be a worse movie. And again, much like a Tom Cruise movie, Mel Gibson just wants to kick ass and doesn't really give a shit about the details. Right? It's a completely insane movie that I hate.
Okay. Let's talk about a good movie. How about The Pillars of the Earth?
So The Pillars of the Earth, I'll shortly talk about this one. It's based on a novel by Ken Follett, British novelist, wrote thrillers. And as a young boy, Follett was from a nonconformist church in England, which meant they were Protestants that were not Church of England. And a lot of the Protestants in England who were not Church of England hated the ostentation of the Church of England. They didn't like the idea of high church, which is basically Catholicism in English, right? They hated that. And so on a school trip as a young boy, Follett goes to St. James Cathedral in downtown London. And he's stunned. It's this huge, magnificent building with these soaring windows and the stained glass and this incredible work of art. And he started doing a little research about cathedrals, read a book in the library, whatever, and it sort of stuck with him. And years later, he'd written thrillers, but he decided to write a book about the building of a cathedral because he saw in a book that it sometimes took decades to build a cathedral. So The Pillars of the Earth is a mini-series the BBC made based on Ken Follett's book. You can find it on Netflix, and it's about the generation-long struggle of a prior Philip to build a cathedral in Kingsbridge so that they can have a fair and have pilgrims come and sort of make it into a town. And it's that the local nobles don't want it, they'll take their business away, and there's all kinds of politicking, and it involves a whole cover-up about a civil war in England in the 11th century, the anarchy involving, among other things, Empress Maud, who had been the wife of the English king who died, and she married the Holy Roman Emperor and attempted to unionize the Holy Roman Empire and England. It was a whole thing. And so in terms of accuracy, the Pillars of the Earth invents a fictional town, Kingsbridge, and it invents a fictional cathedral, which doesn't exist, but it accurately depicts so much about the Middle Ages, right? The frame story about the anarchy, Empress Maud, and King Henry, all of it is accurate. Some action going on in the bathroom. Not in the weird way that it sounded like. It was just my kids in there. And so all of the frame stuff is accurate. And in terms of depicting life in the Middle Ages, that's the way it is. That's the way it is. It's really a true to form book. And so it's one of those movies it's not totally accurate, but if you watch it, you're getting a pretty accurate depiction of what things in the Middle Ages like. And of course, if you like books, I can't recommend his books enough in this series. He wrote The Pillars of the Earth, 1100s, World Without End, about the same town in the 1300s, and then Column of Fire, about the same town in the 1500s. And then he also wrote The Evening in the Morning, came out a couple months ago, and it was about the same town in the 900s. So it's 900, 1100, 1300, 1500. And so it's like 600 years of British history through the eyes of the inhabitants of this little town. And they're just such great books. I normally don't like historical fiction, but those are among my favorites because they're so good. And the miniseries that was on BBC and Netflix is just superb. It just couldn't be beat.
No suggestions right now. Is there one you want to talk about?
I just pick one. It's fine.
Good, bad, or okay?
Okay.
Nicholas and Alexandra.
So, well, briefly, Nicholas and Alexandra is another good one. It's based on the book by Robert Massey, and it's about Nicholas and Alexandra's life. And it's not totally accurate, but it is a solid depiction of the sort of the end of the Russian Empire. Right, it's got all the great points. It's got Trotsky and Lenin and the rise of the communists. It's got the total mismanagement of World War I. It's got the mysticism of Alexandra and the indecisiveness of Nicholas. It's got the tension with their kids. It's got the crazy, mad Rasputin, who they ends up getting murdered, and it all comes crashing. The final scene of the movie is the execution of Nicholas, right? And so, again, some of the details are wrong, but the feeling is absolutely great, and it's based off of a wonderful book by the late Robert Massey, who wrote about Nicholas Alexandria because his son, Robert Kislock Massey, was himself a hemophiliac. So he wrote about another family that had a hemophiliac son, Nicholas and Alexandra. And so I like that one. It's a great book. It's a great book. And it was a pretty good movie.
Chris yet again asks about The Untouchables.
I mean, a wonderful lionization of Elliot Ness. I mean, and more or less all of the details are fictional. They did get Al Capone on tax fraud. Accurate. The story of The Untouchables owes more to the television show from like the 50s than it does to any actual history. But it's a good movie. Wonderful portrayal by Sean Connery as the old Irish police officer. Right? And the scene where they get the accountant at the train station coming off the train, and he's got the baby carriage coming down the steps, and Anthony Garcia stops it with his foot and the pistol. You can't beat that. It's fantastic. But more sensational than it is necessarily accurate.
Okay, let's cover some more history here. How about Last of the Mohicans?
So Last of the Mohicans is actually really good. It's a 1992 movie by Michael Mann based on the James Fenimore Cooper novel, early 19th century, the first of the Leatherstocking Tales. It tells the story of Natty Bumppo, which is his name in the book, and he is the adopted white son of Chingachgook, who is the last chief of the Mohicans, and he's got a white son, and he's also got a Indian son named Uncas. And the three of them have lived this sort of frontier life on the edges of the American colonies. And of course, in 1756, the fight between the British and the French empires for control of North America, the 7 Years' War, erupts, and they get sort of swept up into the events of the war. And that's what the novel's about. The story itself is wonderful. James Fenimore Cooper wrote a great action story. It's got a love story. It's got a chase scene. It's got everything you would want. But the movie is actually really good. It accurately depicts some of the Native Americans. It's got a wonderful portrayal by Wes Studi of the malevolent Maugwa, who is the terrible chief of the he's, I want to say, Huron. But the opening of the movie depicts the frontier between New York State, New York Colony, and Canada is on fire. The French and their Indian allies are raiding. They drive a huge crowd of people to Fort William Henry, north of Albany. The French besiege the fort, they capture it, and then the retreating English are ambushed by the disaffected French Indian allies who don't think they got enough goods out of the taking the fort. That first 45 minutes of the movie couldn't be more accurate. That was really, and it was a huge thing in England. They called it the Massacre of Fort William Henry, and it was what pushed Prime Minister William Pitt over the edge of being able to get a declaration of war against France, which, of course, it was a huge thing in 1756. It was an enormous thing. Fun story. That same year, George Washington had participated in an abortive attack on Fort Duquesne, a French fort, near where today stands the site of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The first time George Washington ever saw, not the first time, but one of the first times he ever saw combat. And so I love Las Vegas. It's got a great portrayal. Daniel Day-Lewis does a stellar job as the main character. Everybody else does a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful job. The writing is great. The music is superb. And the first half of the movie is really the historically accurate part. Then it diverges into the chase sequence and the action story. But the first half couldn't be more accurate. It was a killer movie. Highly recommend. And I believe I own that on DVD. I believe it's over here somewhere on DVD. Yes, right there. Yeah, it's a solid movie.
Okay, Tim asks about Dances with Wolves.
I mean, whatever. Probably not accurate in terms of the details. Accurate in terms of the idea that, like, well, and of course, this wonderful white savior, right? White dude comes into the civilization of Indians, is the coolest guy around, and they teach him everything. Again, like Fern Gully and Avatar, and this is the same story over and over again, right? A sympathetic portrayal of Native Americans, sure. Accurate, probably not. Right.
Okay, so Chrissy mentions Free State of Jones.
That one is accurate. There really was this like crazy, like independence-minded thing, and there really was like a civil war. It was in like, I forget where the Free State of Jones was. It was in like South Carolina or something. But they really did declare independence and got like crushed. And so I don't know the details on that one, but I remember looking it up on Wikipedia and reading about it and being like, wow, the movie is actually pretty accurate. It was a surreal selection of events. I mean, pick a bad one.
U571.
So let's talk about U571. Holy shit. Okay, so we're going to talk some bad World War II movies, okay? So if you want to submarine movies, there's a pair, Das Boot and U571. Das Boot is got Jürgen Prochnow as the commander of a German submarine, and it depicts this sort of year or two in the life of these submariners as they wage the Battle of the Atlantic in 1941 and 42 against the Americans and the British. A stellar movie. A real reach of a performance because they stuck all these guys in a wet. They built a submarine and basically made them live in it for a while and filmed them. And it was just a wonderful movie. It's just the tension of these guys in this little tiny submarine pinging sonar and stuff. It was great. And so if you like war movies, you cannot beat Das Boot. It is a modern classic. I watched it in grad school with all my buddies, and we got hilariously shit-faced drinking Ukrainian vodka watching Das Boot in the German. On the other hand, U571 depicts the events whereby the Americans gain access to the German code-breaking machine Enigma. The Germans had developed a code, Enigma, we called it, and it used these machines that look like crazy typewriters to encrypt and decrypt the messages. And we had already gotten an Enigma machine from the Polish. The Polish got one, took it to the British, and the British like weren't returning their calls. And the Polish had to finally come in and be like, "Look, do you assholes want this or not? Like, look, it's a freaking code machine." And the British were finally like, "Oh shit, maybe we do." But what they needed were the books that told you what settings to turn your Enigma machine to in order to be able to decrypt and encrypt how it worked basically. And so the way they did it, which the movie depicts accurately, is that when the German submarines who used the Enigma to communicate with their home bases, when they ran out of food and supplies, they would radio in, and the Germans would send a big submarine called a milk cow, and the milk cow would come out in the middle of the night, meet them, and give them, water, food, torpedoes, fuel, and stuff, and then disappear. Well, one of these submarines radios for help, and so they know right where it is. So the idea is they're going to take a submarine full of commandos. They're going to pretend to be a German submarine. They're going to show up and be like, "Oh, hey, we're going to help you." And when the guys open the hatch, they're going to storm the submarine, kill the crew, take the code books, and sink it. And then when the milk cow shows up, it'll just think, well, the submarine was damaged and it sunk and it's just gone. And the crucial thing is the Germans won't know the code books are in the hands of the Allies, which is what's so important, right? So U571 gets it all right, except because the Americans are assholes, we switch the heroes of the story from British submarine pilots and crew to American ones. Totally fake. Totally fake. If you take the entire movie and replace every American with a British guy, the movie's accurate. As it stands, the movie's garbage. It's completely stupid.
Relatedly, do you want to talk about The Imitation Game?
The Imitation Game is a related one. Benedict Cumberbatch stars as the late, great mathematician Alan Turing. He goes to Bletchley Park, the secret head of the code breaking in the British government. They've got the Enigma machine, but they can't crack the code. You can do it by hand, but it's sort of like trying to guess someone's PIN at the ATM. You could brute force hack it by just punching in PIN numbers 4 digits at a time until you get the right one. But it might take hours and hours. And then every night at midnight, the Germans change the PIN. They change the code. And so Turing shows up as a mathematical prodigy and automates the process by building computers called bombs. Infamous scene in the movie has the same actor that played Tywin Lannister. plays the head of Bletchley Park, and Turing comes in. Benedict, what's the same guy? Of course I can't remember his name. He's a British theater actor. He's sitting at the desk. Benedict Cumberbatch comes in and says, basically, I want to build a machine to automate it. And Charles Dance is the actor. Charles Dance says, that's stupid, and I'm in a movie, and I have to be the bad guy, and I have to tell you no, and you have to do it anyway and prove me wrong, because that's the heroes of movies. They're always rebels. And so, and then Benedict Cumberbatch builds the bomb, and it works, and Charles Dance says, well, I guess reluctantly I accept the March of Progress. False. Completely false. The Bletchley Park was built as a moonshot. It was intended for people to try out crazy ideas. If you came in and tried out a crazy idea, they would say, that's your job, do it. If it fails, try something else. If it works, great. And so when Cumberbatch, playing Alan Turing, shows up and says, I kind of have an idea to automate it, Charles Dance would have said, great, take some guys, do it. Take a shed, take a hut. They called them huts, the Quonset huts, and build whatever you want. If it works, you've automated the code breaking, right? If it doesn't work, well, we weren't any worse off than we were. And that's why they were paying him. Right? And so that entire movie is just bullshit, because it depicts Turing as single-handedly bucking the establishment, whereas in fact, the establishment was like paying him to do exactly what he did. And he didn't do it by himself. There's a team of guys. He programmed the bombs, but he didn't design them and build them alone. Right? And so that movie is not really very good. It gets the one crucial fact wrong. Of course, and the drama of the movie would be much less if he went into Charles Dance and produced a bunch of diagrams. Dance is depicted in the movie as not getting what computers are and being like, this is all stupid. In fact, that guy was a mathematician. And so he looked at Turing's stuff and was like, oh, yeah, no, this is definitely worth a shot. Like, definitely you should give it. If this doesn't work, it doesn't work. But, like, this is interesting enough that it definitely should be. It should be given a go. And so that's a garbage movie. And it makes me sad because Benedict Cumberbatch is not a terrible actor. Alan
Turing's an amazing person.
Is a famous person who justifiably deserves significant recognition, both for his efforts at Bletchley Park and for his efforts in establishing mechanical computers, computer programming languages, artificial intelligence theory, the Turing test. But that movie does nothing justice. It doesn't do justice to the code-breaking effort, Turing's character, or any of that stuff. And it makes everybody else out to be an asshole, which is not accurate. This is wrong.
Hidden Figures.
Cindy mentioned Hidden Figures. Hidden Figures is pretty accurate. They pretty much accurately summed up the lives of the women at NASA. And the most fascinating thing is the depiction of the huge room full of African-American women doing math calculations as fast as they could by hand. That was what originally, when you said calculator, you didn't mean a device that you punched math into. You literally meant a person that you would give math problems to who would do them and tell you what your answer was. And often, the multiple calculators do the same problem. You would do it, they would do it, you would check your answers. And if you didn't get an answer that agreed, you'd go back and do it again, right? And so the idea that all these women are just sitting around waiting, and then the engineers come in with a bunch of math, and they sit there and do the math and get them the answer. That's what computers essentially got rid of. And it was it Viola Davis? Yes. It was Octavia Spencer was the lady who realizes that the mechanical computer that they've got is going to replace all of the women. And
I remember which, because it's not Katherine Johnson, it's not Mary Jackson, it was
it was the other lady who sneaks into the library to steal the book.
Code.
She learned Fortran. But that's accurate. She was correct in saying, like, this big machine is essentially going to automate the work of all the women that I supervise, because instead of needing to go like break the problem up into chunks and give it to all these women and slide rules and pens of paper, we're just going to punch it into a machine and it's going to spit out the answer or whatever. But in terms of the particular life of Katherine Johnson, that was
Dorothy Vaughan.
What's that?
Dorothy Vaughan.
Dorothy Vaughan. Yeah, she learned Fortran. She taught herself Fortran to be able to program the computer. And there's the great scene. They taught it all the women so they became computer technicians.
They had jobs.
But there's a scene where she wanders in the movie and like turns it on and like, what the hell are you doing? She's like operating the computer, and she gets it to do a calculation to prove that she has to do it. And so that movie's pretty accurate. And the depiction of the human automation of some of the early engineering work in the NASA is actually pretty accurate.
All right, I'm limiting that to just under 10 more minutes. So if you have another movie you want to ask about, go ahead and do that. I'm going to ask him about Saving Private Ryan.
Okay, so Saving Private Ryan is an okay movie. The rest of the movie after the opening scene is somewhat fanciful. And I mean, the scene where they finally fight at the Meuse River against the Germans and lure them into the trap and Private Ryan, you can't get a better war scene than that's great. They've got they ambush the tanks with the sticky bombs, and they've got the machine gunner.
But what about the original premise of all the
it's nonsense.
Ryan,
it's a fake
Ryan
story.
Kids.
Yeah, it was a fake story. The Sullivan brothers were 4 brothers on the deck of a destroyer in the Pacific. They did get killed, and they just sent their brother home, and it wasn't a big freaking deal. They just found him, and they're like, get on the plane and go And it was like there wasn't like it was a ridiculous sort of story they made. But the first 25 minutes that depict the actual attack at D-Day, that's pretty accurate. That's a shockingly accurate depiction of what it would have been like to ride into Utah Beach on a landing ship infantry and get your ass chewed up by a German MG-42 while you run up the beach and get shot up. I mean, that was dead on. Paul Fussell, who was always a curmudgeon, famously said they should cut that part of the movie out, put it in the schools, and say, "Aren't you glad you weren't there?" And which is, I mean, yeah, pretty accurate as it turned out. But yeah, the rest of the movie was a somewhat fanciful war story. That, on the other hand, was pretty accurate.
All right, I'm going to switch to a different historical topic, The Last Emperor.
So The Last Emperor is a great movie by Bernardo Bertolucci about Puyi, the last Chinese emperor. And it's a really sympathetic portrayal of the fall of the Chinese Empire, the warlord period in the teens and 20s, and the rise of communism after Puyi ended up becoming a communist, right? And a good comparison can be made between Empires of the Sun, which has Christian Bale star as the young boy who ends up in the POW camp, and this movie, which does a lot more to illustrate what the whole period of the two movies, World War II, was like for the Chinese. Right, Empire of the Sun gave you a sense of what it was like for one rich kid, whereas The Last Emperor gave you a sense of what it was like for a billion Chinese people, right? And so I thought it was a stellar movie. It's based on Puyi's memoir, which is problematically accurate, but they filmed it on set. The Chinese government gave them permission to film it in the Forbidden City. Interesting note, there's a scene depicting the rape of Nanking, the 1937 Japanese attack on the city of Nanking and the butchery of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Chinese people. When they edited the movie for release in Japan, the Japanese government edited that out. And Bertolucci was furious, and they edited it back in. And they at his insistence, they put it back in. They thought that Japanese filmgoers wouldn't want to see a scene of Japanese people butchering Chinese, which is significant because it's still a stumbling block in Japanese-Chinese relations today. But so I recommend that movie. It's a whopper. It's like a 3-hour-long movie, but it was a good one, I thought.
The Post.
So The Post is about. It's got Meryl Streep, and it's got Bob Odenkirk, and it's got what's his name, Tom Hanks. Meryl Streep plays Katharine Graham, the legendary owner of the Washington Post, and it depicts the frame story is Daniel Ellsberg, a naval officer, goes to Vietnam to do a survey for then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara about whether we're winning the Vietnam War. Years and years later, the Vietnam War drags on. Tens of thousands more Americans have died. 100,000 more Vietnamese have died. And Ellsberg, working in the Pentagon, rediscovers the study and decides to secretly release it to the public to prove that the Johnson administration, not less the Nixon administration now, knew that the Vietnam War was being lost, years and years earlier. Right? And of course, the Nixon administration, angry at the idea that these leaks would be used to attack even its Vietnam policies, sues to prevent the Washington Post from releasing this classified study, which became known as the Pentagon Papers. The Post itself is a good movie about the ethics of doing this. There's a surprisingly riveting series of scenes depicting Katharine Graham and her husband arguing about whether or not they should print this stuff, and are they open to legal action by the government if they print classified documents. And so that was really good. Ellsberg's sort of journey to producing it was great. But what the Post doesn't do is depict the involvement of the New York Times. And one of the things the New York Times did is they also published the Pentagon Papers, which made it very difficult for the government to sue not one but two and then other major newspapers all at the same time. That's in the movie, where every newspaper in America prints it. So the government would have to sue every single newspaper to get them to take this out of their pages. But at the same time, some of the early work backing up, fact checking the Pentagon Papers was done by the New York Times. And the Post does not illustrate that. It focuses more on the Washington Post. But a good movie about a fascinating moment inside of American politics nonetheless. It's very significant. Where we can also mention, by the way, we crapped on Mel Gibson twice. Let's say a nice thing about him. He made a few years earlier.
You don't need to say a nice thing about him.
Well, he's a Nazi and an anti-Semite, and he's a crazy Catholic, and he's a Holocaust denier, and all sorts of things. But he made a movie in 2004 called We Were Soldiers. It was based on a book written by Colonel Hal Moore, 1st Cavalry, and UPI reporter Joe Galloway. about the 1965 battle in Vietnam, the Ad Drang Valley. Moore and Galloway was a reporter who got flown into the battle, fought alongside Moore, ended up defending an American position with a gun, even though he was a reporter, and then wrote about it afterwards. A very sympathetic book, great book. We Were Soldiers Once and Young, great book about one of the early battles in the Vietnam War. And Mel Gibson made a surprisingly accurate movie. The final scene of the movie depicts a charge where the Americans gun up and run at the Vietnamese to get them to retreat. None of that is accurate. Instead, the fighting just kind of died down, the Vietnamese disappeared, and the Americans evacuated the valley. But the rest of the movie is accurate. It depicts the horrible combat in Vietnam, the terrible confusion of it. There's a really heart-wrenching scene where as casualties begin to mount in the valley, back at the 1st Cavalry's hometown, you can see a taxi cab driving around, and the cab driver's trying to find the addresses to give the notifications of death of the men to their widows. And agonizingly, he stops at Hal Moore's house, where Madeline Stowe is his wife, and she's furious because she thinks he's there to tell her Hal Moore is dead. And instead he said, no, I just don't know where these addresses are, and I've got a whole sheaf of these, because they didn't have casualty notification officers in those days. They made taxi drivers and telegraph guys do it. And so she takes them all. She's got the address book for all the wives, and she goes around and notifies them all that their husbands are being killed. And it was as the battle was happening. They were evacuating people and then sending letters back to the States about their status. It was all happening so fast, which was very unusual. Not at all like any previous war. So that's a really good movie, sympathetic portrayal of the infantrymen in Vietnam fighting. And it does contain a significant good depiction of the North Vietnamese army as well. It depicts the North Vietnamese commander eventually deciding too many of his men have died and evacuating. And it's got a good chunk of the movie is the back and forth portrayals of these two commanders. So not a horrible movie that Mel Gibson made. Right?
Last one, Chrissy asks about Finest Hours. Okay, so I'm looking that one up.
Yeah, we'll give you another one I'll talk about while we do it.
No, because I want to wrap this up.
Devastating.
2016 film.
What's Finest Hours?
Oh, it's the SS Pendleton with 30 sailors sinking.
Yeah,
1952.
In 1952. I don't know that one. That's not a movie that I'm familiar with enough to pontificate about it.
Well, okay then.
Yeah.
It had Chris Pine and Casey Affleck.
I don't know. I'm surprised I don't know about that movie because Chris Pine's all right. He's a good Chris. He's not the bad Chris.
He's not the bad.
He's not the bad Chris.
He is a good Chris.
No, he's not Chris Pratt. What?
Yeah, Christy says it's a Chris Pine movie about the New England Coast Guard. Okay, yeah. So wrap it up. Any last movies you want to talk about?
I mean, give me the sheet. What do we not talk about?
I mean, there's a lot on here. We can't cover everything.
No, I mean, but just so we talked about. I mean, we talk about.
I don't want to go on for another half hour.
Okay, so let me talk about Lincoln.
Okay, talk about Lincoln.
So
last one.
So let's talk about Lincoln. So I don't know how I feel about Steven Spielberg because E.T. remaster, stupid. Indiana Jones 4, stupid. AI, I hate him forever, was a stupid movie. So hot take, Stanley Kubrick, kind of overrated. Steven Spielberg finishing Stanley Kubrick movie, kind of a shit sandwich. But Lincoln. Daniel Day-Lewis plays Abraham Lincoln, right? 16th president of the United States.
I think it's just that you like Daniel Day-Lewis.
He's good. I have here's the DVD right there. There's Abraham Lincoln right there. So what?
No, that's not.
That's Lincoln.
That's actually Lincoln. That's not Daniel Day-Lewis.
That's Lincoln. And so what can we say about it? Well, Daniel Day-Lewis sunk into Lincoln's character. The most authentic portrayal of Lincoln on film is Daniel Day-Lewis. The voice, the high reedy voice, the sort of awkward gangly gait, that's all accurate. That's all accurate. As a person who's read dozens of books about Lincoln, that is accurate. On the other hand, what else can we say? There's some details wrong in the movie. It depicts Lincoln in the telegraph office, which is this giant room. It was a very small, cramped room, but I get why Spielberg did that. You got to have cameras and stuff, right? You can't film in a broom closet. The final scene where Lincoln dies is in the Peterson house across the street from Ford's Theater. Again, a big room full of people. It was about the size of the area I'm talking to you in. There's another inconsistency in when Grant meets Lee at Appomattox. It shows Grant in full uniform played by a British guy. I can't remember his name, but he's there with with Lincoln's son, with Robert Lincoln. And they go into the Wilmer McLean house to meet Lee. Grant showed up late, dressed like a private, covered in mud, and Lincoln's son wasn't there. Jared Taylor is Grant in the movie. He's an English actor who was in Mad Men. He was the least awful person in Mad Men anytime he was on the screen in Mad Men. None of that was really accurate. I get why they did that, though, because they wanted to just make it seem like a cooler story. But the biggest problem I have with Lincoln is that it depicts Lincoln as being the sole author of the 13th Amendment to end slavery. In fact, he was a late convert. It was Republicans in Congress, notably Thaddeus Stevens, member of the House from Pennsylvania, and Charles Sumner, member of the Senate from Massachusetts, who argued to Lincoln that his executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation ending slavery, would not necessarily be enough to make it permanent. And of course, Lincoln pointed out, gosh, but slavery basically disintegrated. So I mean, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And they pointed out, but unless it's written in law, it's not really definitive. And an executive order you issue could be unissued by a subsequent president. A law we pass could be voided. So it's got to be a constitutional amendment. Lincoln, once converted to the cause of the 13th Amendment, enthusiastically supported it. Some of the lobbying that the movie depicts is accurate. But at the same time, it was not necessarily something that Lincoln originated the way that the movie seems to depict. Some of the log rolling in the movie is accurate, though. Some of the crazy, weird things. Lincoln there's a scene where he's like, look, if you can find someone who I can name a post office for, or if you got somebody who I can give a job to, like I can appoint the postmaster of some place, like I'll totally do it to get the votes. Like I'll do anything to get people to be willing to vote for this law. Some of that was accurate, but again, the impetus, Steven Spielberg makes Lincoln the motive force of the 13th Amendment. I don't know that I would necessarily see that as being as accurate.
All right. You want to sign off?
I mean, there's still more movies, but we can talk later.
You can talk about some of them and put them on the Patreon.
That's true. We can do that later. Yeah, we can do that. We got some more. Downfall. We didn't talk about Downfall.
Yeah, let's put those on the Patreon.
So yeah, join us on the Patreon. We'll try to film another video at some point, and we'll throw up some stuff. We got John Wayne. John Wayne does Vietnam. Worst movie ever made about the Vietnam War. The Green Berets. The veterans that saw it in the theater would openly laugh at that. So as always, thanks for being with us. Appreciate everybody in the comments. If you've got a topic you want to hear about in the future, please let us know. Because we'd love to do that. As always, you can support us on Patreon, where we are there, and you can get exciting swag and pictures and stuff. There's a mug, I think.
No, it's a sticker.
It's a stamp.
It's a sticker.
I don't know.
You don't even know what we do.
It's stuff that you can get. So you can get that. And so
as always, like, share, and subscribe.
Yeah, please like, please share, please subscribe. And thanks for being here with us.
Bye. Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye.